In my last video, I introduced you to this book, The Good Old Days, They Were Terrible by Otto Bettman. And tonight I would like to compare his views on housing in the late 1800s and early 1900s with Australian cities today, particularly Perth in Western Australia. I have taken a few notes from the housing chapter in Otto Bettman's book, where he chose the city of New York in 1880 as an example to talk about housing and living conditions. And among all the things that he says is that life among the poor and the middle class was a desperate reality. And to top it all off, the rich and the poor live very close by. The poor dumping their rubbish and waste on the streets right at the entrance and next to these big mansions or luxury apartments that very few had, and they had to put up with that. There was no ruling or legislation or government intervention to help solve this situation. He says that in 1882, 2% of the households in New York had only 2% had water connections, which meant that the rest of the people renting did not have running water. People were advised to close the windows and to keep them shut, regardless of the temperature and the weather, to avoid the polluted air from the animal stench and factory vapors coming from the city. The air in New York in those days was completely polluted, causing a lot of health problems, especially respiratory problems for children and adults alike. Now indoors it was even worse because they had to keep the door shut to avoid the outside, but they had to cook in those tiny rooms, tiny apartments. They had to warm the bathtubs, and this was all wood fire. So the safety was non-existent as well. It was very dangerous, and they indeed had lots and lots of fires and victims of fires, people dying because of that, and not having escape routes from the apartments. So that was another problem additional to the rest. Now the apartments were very old. They would house sometimes whole families in one room, and this could be 2 adults, 2, 3 children, all breathing these fumes from the cooking, all breathing the polluted air from the outside if it came inside, or having respiratory problems, coughing and fevers. It was very common to have people with fever, especially children. And on top of that, they were the landlords were considered monsters, menacing monsters. They would abuse and profit and really take advantage of the poor because they were constantly raising their rentals. And the more they raised them, the less the poor people could afford them. The incomes would never be enough, and sometimes some owners and managers of businesses where the poor people worked even would lower their incomes without any notice and without any government intervention to avoid that and protect them. None at all. So another thing that he says here is that they would constantly increase the rentals, forcing people mercilessly to leave the properties. And sometimes they would be evicted by force, thrown on the streets with all their belongings and the children as well. And they did not care about the safety of the tenants, their health, the future they may have, where were they going. The landlords didn't care about that. They just needed the money they wanted, and somehow they were going to get it. And if it is not this tenant, it'll be somebody else. So therefore, no legislation to control the situation, and on top of that, they had an influx of European migration that were coming into cities like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, in masses. So the rental properties were not enough. The demand was far higher than the offer. And it was impossible. You know, the real estate values would go up and up and up because there was so much demand that the landlords would take advantage of anything they could. And they got away with it quite a bit, which is very sad to say. So all this created such a shortage of living households, such a poor condition because there was no maintenance of any kind. You know, the gas in some of these properties was leaking constantly, and no running water, no sewerage as we know it properly, not a proper toilet or bathroom at all. And that's how they had to live, day after day, without any hope of looking into the future and say, well, things will get better if we earn more money. Well, it's a catch-22 situation. The money was not going to be there, therefore you will not be able to rent. And if you did, it would be such a miserable household that it would ruin your life and the future of your children, as simple as that. And that was the housing situation in New York in those days. By 1884, he says, around 40,000 poor families were evicted from rental properties because they couldn't pay the rent. Now, that we're talking about 1 or 2 years, 40,000 families on the streets. So the problem was compounded constantly. You know, there was no hope to rely on a lawyer to defend you, to help you, to speak for you. Nothing you did was worth it. You know, they would sometimes regard your job as good or bad, and you know, if there was somebody else who would do your same job for less money, they would just throw you out in the street. You lost your job and somebody else would take over, and nobody cared. So these were, you know, the good old days in the 1800s in cities like New York, which is very, very sad when we have this romantic idea about the good old days. When we compare what we just saw about the good old days living conditions in the 1800s, we find some common factors repeating themselves in modern times today here in Perth, Western Australia, and other cities in Australia. Our housing situation here is very serious. It's creating a lot of problems at social level, economic level, health, rates of depression, anxiety, desperation, and lack of hope are now very, very common. And not a day goes by without seeing on the news, on television and anywhere else, that our housing situation here in Australia, it's very, very serious. Rentals have become literally unaffordable for most. The hope of buying a home, like in the, you know, Australia land of plenty of 30 years ago, is gone. Even professionals, young professionals, cannot even remotely dream of buying a home. And if they do, they're going to be paying it the rest of their lives, if they can. It may not happen either. We have here a lot of migration coming into the cities, and that is creating a high demand for rental properties. We have people coming to study, youngsters, who find themselves all of a sudden, you know, arriving with the excitement of studying in Australia and having a future. And they have to really spend their nights working, some of them until midnight, in order to be at uni, in class, tutorials, completing assignments the following morning at 8 o'clock. So there's not a mental health situation healthy in that regard. A student who is tired cannot perform, and eventually it seems like there's studying time and effort is wasted. So these students have decided to, in order to live in a decent place, they get together 4 or 5 of them, they share the rent, and of course, there are the social problems that brings, but at least they have a place to live, and then they can continue with the small jobs to pay the rest of their expenses and continue studying. We have spoken to a couple of mothers. I was very surprised to find young solo mothers, so they're receiving a very small pension for the children, a family benefit, and they cannot pay the rent, and they were saying that openly. We cannot afford to pay any decent rent today because it's so high. It's only for rich people. And therefore they have registered as permanent house sitters. So they take care of properties from people who are traveling, people who are so well off that they can leave their homes and pay somebody to look after the place. And that allows them to have a decent place to sleep, to cook, to eat, to enjoy the garden, the patio, to have a parking garage, and have the children in a good environment for as long as that period lasts. So it could be sitting for a month or 2 weeks or even less. And then immediately after that, they jump onto the next house they have in their calendar already booked. And they go around doing that constantly in order to have a life, a little bit of a life, even if it is not their own home. So they can, make money with whatever the owners are paying to pay for petrol, school expenses, food, outings maybe, save some money, and on and on and on and on. But that is a very... you cannot really rely on that to last forever. It may be that suddenly for a whole month, there are no houses advertising for a carer, a house sitter. So you are facing a lot of uncertainties, and it makes life very difficult, and it puts a lot of emotional and mental pressure on the mothers as well. The children, fortunately, are not too aware of what's happening, but it affects them as well. There's not a settled home to live, their bedrooms are not theirs. It is just, we're just passing by. That's what they think and they feel. Other mothers, we have found that they have chosen to sleep in the cars with the children because they don't have even the hope of finding a house to sit or somebody to help them. Charity organizations have waiting lists that are too long, so you may be months and months waiting for a charity organization to find a home for you. And that is a real problem. Of course, people who live like that in tents in the park, sometimes they have been evicted by the police. The government intervenes. They cannot park their cars everywhere just to sleep the night. They need to take a proper shower, to cook a proper meal, so they may rely on public toilets, but the rest, how do you deal with the rest, especially when there are children involved? Other people who have professions, good incomes, cannot afford some rents either. So they have turned back to their parents or relatives and live back with parents as they did when they were young and they were students, because there's no other choice. And at least the parents' house was large enough for the whole family, so the bedrooms are still there, so they can have a decent house to live in. But of course, it's not the same as having your own place. So that's an additional form of mental and emotional pressure. And it doesn't make happy the parents sometimes because they're about to retire. They may be planning to go somewhere else and relying on the sale of their house in order to pay for their retirement. And of course, the children and grandchildren are not very happy either because it's not completely their home, and they cannot do 100% what they would like to do in that house. So all in all, fortunately for us, in a way, we have real estate agents, we have legislation, we have government intervention, we have regulators, but any dealing with renting or buying a home nowadays in Australia is a lengthy legal process. It can cost quite a bit of money, and it may throw people in desperation into perennial debt because everybody needs a settled home to live and raise the children. So we have, for example, in rental leases, you have to sign a contract in order to rent the property. Just to give you an example, 31 years ago when I arrived in Australia, we didn't have all this technology ruling everything as we have nowadays. You used to go to the newsagent, buy your newspaper, and all the houses, all the properties for rent and for sale were advertised in the newspaper. So you would go to your listing, pick up a house. They were selected by suburb, decided to call the real estate agent. The real estate agent will give you an appointment to see the house, and if you liked it, you could sign right there and then. The rental prices were very affordable. You liked the house, you got the house. As simple as that. You would sign a lease, be subject to every 3 months to an inspection of the house, just as a routine MO, modus operandi of the real estate agents, and that was it. And sometimes you could rent a house for many, many years. Very seldom were you asked to leave the house. Nowadays, if you want to rent a house, everything is done online. It's very hard to scroll and navigate through the real estate agencies. Sometimes the properties are not on show whenever you want to. You have to make an appointment. You have to wait to be contacted by the real estate agent to see when the inspection is going to be. And when you finally manage to go and inspect the house because you're interested, the price is more or less decent. With a lot of effort, you will, go as far as a certain amount of rent. Beyond that, you just don't even look. And once you get there, you find that there are between 15 or 30 people in line to see that house that day. It means that there is a lot of demand, and therefore the real estate agents now give you 15 minutes to inspect the house very quickly, fill in the form to request, to be considered for rental, and wait. And that was it. Because there is no need now to deliver a home beautifully repainted and maintained inside and outside. The demand is so high that now many owners and real estate agents don't really want to bother to deliver a house in perfect condition. And looking at houses many times, as I did in the past, 50% of the houses were in such poor condition that we could not even dream of renting that house. Not for the standard of living that we like. I don't live in luxury, but I like a decent house to live in because it's going to be my home. So that's how it happens. And then once, if you're lucky, considered and offer the house, then you immediately have to sign a lease, pay a deposit, and wait until the date to move in is settled. There are quite a few terms and conditions. The leases are very long, very detailed, and one of them is, of course, the owners or the real estate agents cannot evict you from a place unless you have done something really bad. In the terms and conditions, you have 21 days to inspect the house once you moved in, check for anything that you observe that needs repair, fixing, repainting sometimes, which they don't do as often anymore. And after that, if for any reason the owner wants or the real estate advises that you need to vacate the property, legally you're entitled to 21 days to pack and go, which means finding another place. And by the time you have been 1, 2, or 3 years in this property, rents have gone up dramatically again, but your income does not increase at the same rate. So the problem keeps multiplying and multiplying. They're trying to build more houses. The government says that they're going to build more houses, but there is a shortage of construction workers here in Australia. So, you know, the time required to build the houses is 2-3 times as much as they should be. So you may be trying to buy a home and you have to wait years sometimes until it finally, you know, is ready to be, for you to move in. And that's for properties that you want to purchase, that you want to buy. If you want to rent, the story is the same. Finding people to repair the houses, the owners are not going to worry too much about that. It'll be your responsibility. If you like it, you take it. If you don't, you miss out. It's as simple as that. So in comparison, all these problems that we have now in modern times here in Australia are really bearable to a certain extent, because you have support, you have who to turn to in case of problems, doubts, difficulties, which they didn't have in those good old days of the 1800s. And there are lawyers and courts and mediation officers who will try to solve the problems as best they can, but sometimes the waiting times are very, very long. And therefore, you have to really accept the fact that every year that rent is going to be raised. So are you better off accepting the raise in rent, or would you start looking somewhere else? Which implies that, you know, in those 21 days notice the owner or the real estate agent gives you to move out, you have to pack, you have to find another place, pay a deposit, pay the moving expenses, shift maybe to a neighborhood that is not close to the schools anymore, or to your work. And then on top of that, try to recover the deposit from the house. Hopefully it'll be given to you if there are no major repairs to do to the house, and leave the house spotless, clean, and ready to be rented out to somebody else. So it is not easy, but we have all those options. And compared to the good old days, I rather live in these days. I would call these days the good old days, because I suppose that in 200 years from now, 2226, people will look at this like the good old days, and hopefully they will be. And if not, hopefully their modern times in the future, in 200 years, will be better than what they are today. So with that, I'll leave you for now, hoping that those of you in Australia struggling to meet your rentals and your difficulties find it very easy if you give a thought to the days of the 1800s in glamorous cities like some of the American capitals. I think right now I'd rather stay here in my present and not return to the good old days. Thank you.